Oh, beautiful and tasty bananas. It is easy not to think about all the atrocities committed by the United States to continue to profit from this industry. Today, I want to tell you about the time that American fruit companies, supported by the CIA and the United States government, overthrew a democratically elected president and instated a series of dictatorships, all of course just to keep their profits intact. This is the story of Guatemala and their president, Jacobo Arbenz. But before we get started, I need to provide you with some context. We will have to go back to the year 1898, right at the end of the Spanish-American War. After its victory over Spain, the United States was finally in a position to turn the Monroe Doctrine into a reality and began its dominance over Central America. President Theodore Roosevelt had already publicly expressed his belief that the United States should be the main beneficiary of Central American production. This is why they sought to force their hegemony through a series of interventions in the region. Some were armed and violent, as in Nicaragua and Haiti. Others were achieved under duress, such as the 1903 treaty with Cuba, a treaty that strongly benefited the United States over Cuba. But the case of Guatemala was different, because a series of dictators were willing to accommodate the economic interest of Americans in the nation in exchange for receiving support for their brutal regimes. One of them was the regime led by Manuel Estrada Cabrera, who, without congressional support, allowed entry and awarded a multitude of contracts to a US company called United Fruit Company. This company, formed from the union of several of the largest fruit companies in the United States, followed a very aggressive vertical integration policy. They were determined to control every stage of the fruit production process, from the highways, railroads, and trains that they used to transport goods, to the houses where workers lived, and even the electricity that powered their cities. Eventually, United Fruit came to control the telephone and telegraph facilities. They managed the only major port in the country and even succeeded in monopolizing banana exports. And all of this just to maximize their efficiency and profits. The situation worsened considerably under the regime of Jorge Ubico, Manuel Estrada's successor. Ubico was elected thanks to the support of Guatemala's elites, who sought to appease the workers' movements and protests that had arisen as a consequence of the 1929 Great Depression. And immediately after coming to power, the newly elected president took action to oppress the working class. He replaced the existing debt peonage with a brutal vagrancy law that required all men of working age that did not possess land to work 100 days for no pay. Note here the clear class distinction that was being made, for only people who did not possess land and were thus poor had to endure this. Ubico also passed a law that gave landowners complete immunity from any actions they may take to protect their property. Now, what this meant in reality is that landowners had the ability to do literally anything they wanted to their workers, including executing them on the spot if they so desired. And if all of this was not enough, Ubico increased the police's authority so that they could shoot or detain anyone who was being suspected of violating these new working laws. And of course, just like his predecessors, he continued to make massive concessions to United Fruit Company at the expense of Guatemala's own well-being. He gave them almost 500,000 acres of public land for only the promise of building a port. A promise that was, of course, never enforced. Now, United Fruit Company was already evicting smaller landowners and taking their land to repurpose it for banana plantations. But this process accelerated under Jorge Ubico, who not only did not raise a finger to stop this injustice from happening, but actually rewarded the Americans with a tax exemption. Yes, you heard that right. The largest company in Guatemala that owned the largest amount of land and employed the largest amount of workers was barely required to pay any taxes at all. This was the situation in Guatemala by 1944, when the Guatemalan people finally decided they had endured enough. A revolution ended the tyrannical government and finally allowed free elections to be held. Under the conservative president Juan José Arevalo, there were certain advances, such as the creation of minimum wage and the introduction of state plantations. But he also banned unions in small companies. Eventually, union leaders did manage to force him to pass a few additional reforms, such as the prohibition of workplace discrimination and the creation of health and safety standards for the workplace. But it was in 1950 that the situation became really interesting, because the winner of those elections was a man called Jacobo Arbenz. Arbenz prepared a series of measures to improve the quality of life for Guatemalans while limiting United Fruit's control over the country. He reinforced the union's right of workers and passed a series of social reforms, one of the most important being the redistribution of territories the United Fruit controlled but did not use. The government offered to pay United Fruit exactly the amount of money they had declared the land to be worth, $1,185,000. However, the company, knowing well that what was at stake was the political control over the people and land of Guatemala, refused this offer, claiming that the land was actually worth closer to $20 million. Arbenz, of course, refused to pay this ridiculous amount. Now, it is important to note that Arbenz was neither a communist nor an anti-capitalist. In fact, this is what he said during his inaugural speech.
Con relación al capital extranjero, manifiesta que no se opondrá a él, en tanto que signifique progreso para el país y que no atente contra la soberanía nacional ni afecte derechos inalienables de Guatemala.
To limit United Fruit's control over the nation, Arbenz built ports and highways to compete with their possessions. He also built a new hydroelectric plant to offer cheap electricity that would challenge the existing American monopoly. Now, these reforms might sound reasonable considering the dire situation that people in Guatemala were in. However, United Fruit Company did not look kindly onto these new improvements. After all, every penny the workers received was a penny they would not receive as profits. Every improvement in the workers' quality of life came at a cost to the company's profits. Faced with this terrible insubordination, United Fruit visited the President of the United States, Dwight Eisenhower, to warn him of the terrible communist leader that had taken over Guatemala, even though Arbenz was not only not a communist, but also had no ties whatsoever with the Soviet Union. Like many times in history, calling someone a communist was not really about whether they are a communist or not. Anti-communism is not based on reason or logic. It is a tool to destroy the enemies of big capital. Any improvement in the quality of life of workers, any restriction to the indiscriminate power of capital is labeled as communist and is destroyed. Who do you turn to when the police is the one assaulting you? Guatemalan leaders tried everything. They appealed to the United Nations, the Organization of American States, the international press, and even the United States itself, hoping that somehow reason could prevail. But it was all in vain. The American president had decided that Arbenz was a communist and that he needed to be eliminated. As the American empire approached and prepared to overthrow his government, the Guatemalan Foreign Ministry, Guillermo Torielo, lamented that the US was categorizing as communism every manifestation of nationalism or economic independence, any desire for social progress, any intellectual curiosity, and any interest in progressive liberal reforms. Headquarters for the operations were established in Opa-locka in Florida on the outskirts of Miami. Nicaraguan dictator Anastasio Somoza lent his country out as an airstrip and for hundreds of men, both Guatemalan exiles and mercenaries from the US and other Central American countries, to be trained. The training did not consist only in the use of weapons, but also in radio broadcasting and in the art of sabotage and demolition. They also gathered Soviet-marked weapons to be planted inside Guatemala as supposed evidence of Soviet intervention. Then came an intense propaganda campaign against Arbenz. As would become their standard practice when overthrowing governments in Latin America, the CIA used their influence over newspapers all over Latin America to have them print articles against Jacobo Arbenz to give the impression that rejection of his ideals were coming naturally. They also distributed 100,000 copies of a pamphlet called Chronology of Communism in Guatemala, as well as 20,000 anti-communist posters. They even produced 3 movies that described how terrible communism would be for Guatemala and had them be played in theaters in Guatemala free of charge. The CIA thus let its propaganda spread across Guatemala, and on the 18th of June 1954, they decided that the time for the offensive had come. Planes dropped leaflets over Guatemala demanding the immediate resignation of Arbenz, threatening to bomb the country if he refused. As promised, over the weekend, US airplanes bombed ports, fuel tanks, ammunition reserves, military barracks, the international airport, and even a school. So intense was the terror campaign that the US Embassy put loudspeakers on the embassy's roof and played the sounds of exploding bombs in order to increase the anxiety of the capital's residents. When Arbenz tried to make a public speech on the radio to calm down the population, the transmission was blocked by the CIA. Then, the CIA's army crossed into Guatemala from Honduras and managed to capture a few towns before being stopped by the Guatemalan army. Outnumbered and without popular support, they used advanced propaganda and manipulation strategies to force the withdrawal and eventual surrender of the defending army. Well, how did they achieve this? You see, the CIA had managed to gain control of the largest radio stations in the country, and from them, they broadcast messages declaring that Guatemala was being attacked from all sides. According to these messages that were made to appear as official and were even transmitted through official military channels, the Guatemalan army was being rapidly defeated. Paratroopers had allegedly infiltrated Guatemala City and completely surrounded the positions of the defenders. The agency went as far as to drop dummy parachutes in scattered areas to heighten the belief that a major invasion was taking place. The United Fruit Company, of course, also did their part. They circulated photographs to journalists of mutilated bodies about to be buried in mass graves as supposed evidence of the atrocities committed by the Arbenz regime. The photos were widely disseminated, but a few years later, Thomas McCann, who was in charge of the operation, admitted that even he did not know where the photos came from. They could perfectly well have been victims of either of the two sides or of an earthquake. The point is, they were widely accepted for what they were purported to be, victims of communism. The Arbenz government desperately pleaded for a solution to the conflict before the United Nations. However, the vote was blocked by the United States. The CIA then offered money to Guatemalan officers to switch sides, offering up to $60,000 to each. With mounting pressure, Arbenz was forced to resign. And despite all the rumors that Guatemala was a Soviet base of operations, no communists came to their aid. Castillo Armas would be the new president of Guatemala, and he celebrated the way anti-communists like to do. During the month of July alone, he imprisoned thousands of people on the suspicion of being communist, and many of them were tortured or even executed. In August, he passed a law that created a committee that could declare anyone to be a communist without giving them the right to appeal. Those declared communist could be arbitrarily arrested and were banned from political activities. Castillo Armas halted the agrarian reforms and declared all expropriation that had already taken place to be invalid. United Fruit not only got all of their land back, but the government even banned banana workers from joining unions. And 7 of the largest former union leaders were found dead under mysterious circumstances in Guatemala City. The new regime then prohibited the illiterate population from voting in elections, thus eliminating 75% of the voting population. They closed down opposition newspapers and burned books that they considered to be subversive, things that Arbenz never did. One of them was a young Argentinian doctor called Ernesto Che Guevara who sought refuge in the Argentine embassy. His first wife, Hilde Gadea, wrote the following. Up to that point, he used to say, he was merely a sniper, criticizing from a theoretical point of view the political panorama of our America. From here on, he was convinced that the struggle against the oligarchic system and the main enemy, Yankee imperialism, must be an armed one, supported by the people. For more than 40 years, violence would take over Guatemala, being one of the main reasons why Guatemalans even to this day flee to the United States looking for a better life away from the destruction that the American empire created for its own benefit. And what happened to the United Fruit Company? Surely such an evil company would cease to exist. Unfortunately, we are in a system where anything goes in the name of anti-communism. United Fruit Company did go through a few rough years, but today you can find them under the name of Chiquita. Those watching probably have at some point consumed fruit by the same company that was responsible for these atrocities. It is impossible to estimate how many people died as a direct consequence of the actions of the United States, whether they died directly from being killed or died because of the decline in health or living conditions. Either way, the pain caused by the American empire is incalculable. But hey, at least Guatemala is not communist.